great IAs, great essays that will be coming to the campus. And we hope that we'll be able to host all of you for the tournament as well in association with tournament. And thank you so much for to Indian Debating League for organizing this amazing session for us. IDL is a nationwide tournament platform. They conduct so many tournaments in association with great international comps such as Oxford, Cambridge. Please check out the tournaments as well. They have great learning resources for young debaters right from the school level. Uh, great initiative by IDL. For as of today, we have Dhruva, who is an Harvard and Oxford graduate. He is the co-founder of Luminaire Education. He helps students to start their research journey. He was a part of the ISDS national team. He's the coach for the 2019 WSDC winning Indian team. We are just so blessed to have this amazing opportunity to learn from you. So over to you, Dhruv. Yeah.
Amazing. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear and see me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. So just a heads up to anyone who is listening in, this is very much going to be a session where I expect you guys to be speaking as much as I am. And I know that debaters have no problems talking out loud and sharing everything that's on their minds. So I hope that at least most of you are in a position where you can unmute and share. So if you're able to turn your videos on so that I know that you're alive, and if anyone wants to jump in, making it easier for you to do that as well. So I'll give you guys a second to do that. Excellent. I see a few brave souls, but there's 47 people in the audience. I'm going to wait for another second more to see who else is willing and able to turn their videos on. Excellent. Just a heads up that if I ask a question and someone puts their hand up, I will prioritize the people whose videos are on. So if you want to get the chance to show off how smart you are and how much you know about the world, you benefit from having a video on. Of course, if you can't, that's totally fine as well. But thank you so much, Ideal, for having me. I'm really excited for this session. I know this was meant to happen last week, and I'm so sorry that I had to reschedule. I was battling a terrible sore throat, and you did not want to hear me then. I sounded like I had smoked a full pack of cigarettes right before. But I am feeling better now, and I'm excited to nerd out about one of my favorite topics, which is economics and specifically economic development. So for context,
oh no, I'm not in the meeting to learn. Now that I'm in,
I sure hope that someone in the meeting is here to learn,
Yeah.
even if that person isn't.
Coach, please keep yourself on mute otherwise. Sorry, Dhruva.
Yeah, let's make sure to be on mute when we're not speaking. But just for context, Zen, I think, did an amazing job of introducing me. Let me just fill in some of the details. So I grew up in Chennai. I went to a CBSE school in Chennai called PS Senior Secondary School. Very much a classic CBSE school. People went on to become kind of engineers and doctors and chartered accountants if you were really dumb. And I started doing debate in high school. I started getting really excited by topics in the social sciences. Questions like, why are some countries rich and other countries poor? What causes ethnic conflict and how can we prevent it? So these types of questions were ones that I didn't feel like I could turn anywhere to discuss. And so debate was such an amazing outlet. I found myself spending hours and hours every day watching debate videos, practicing cases, doing kind of research on topics that I was interested in. And as Zen mentioned, I was on the Indian WSDC team in 2011, 12, and 13. I ended up going to the US for undergrad. I studied economics at Harvard, and there I focused kind of on development economics in my research and went on to do a PhD in international development at Oxford as well. Along the way, I was one of the coaches of the WSDC team, and now that I'm finally done with the PhD, it's a long journey. I run an organization called Luminaire that does one-on-one virtual research programs for high school students. If any of you are curious about that, at the end of the call, I'll drop my email in the chat, and you can feel free to reach out to me. So in my time kind of living in India, the UK, and the US, studying economic development from an academic perspective, and now hopefully contributing to it through running an entrepreneurial organization, I've thought deeply about international development. And in today's session, we're going to try to think about a couple of things. The first is, what does the term development really mean? How do we commonly think about it? How do economists think about it? What are the major drivers of economic development? And what are the usual models that historically we've seen countries grow by? That's kind of, and what are the pros and cons of those different models? That's the bulk of what we're going to be talking about. And I think this has enormous impact and potential in debates, because so many debates are explicitly about economic development. So you might have debates about trade protectionism. You might have debates about how Western countries' policies towards developing countries. You might have topics about aid organizations. So you have all these topics that are explicitly about development. But even topics that aren't actually on surface about development tend to have a development-related component in there. So if you're doing a debate about banning a particular thing, so for example, banning alcohol or banning gambling or whatever else, you've got to think about the economic impacts of it. And development, even though we think of it as happening only in developing countries, another related term that we're going to talk about is economic growth. And economic growth is relevant for all countries, regardless of whether you're categorized as a developing country or a developed country. So with that kind of long preamble about what we're going to talk about and why it's important, let's dive in. So as I said, we're going to talk about what development means and why it matters. We're going to talk about how economic growth occurs, and then we'll talk about how development occurs, thinking about these two as slightly different things. So first question then, what does development mean? We're going to take a minute. So I want you guys to read through this in detail. And when you're done reading through this, can you just in the chat say the word money? Some quick readers have jumped in. Atreja, Inesh has read it 3 times, it looks like. Oh, for each paragraph, understood. That makes sense. Awesome, maybe another 30 seconds or so. Awesome. Seems like most of you are done, so let's dive in. So for context, this is an article by a former US ambassador to the United Nations, as well as someone who used to be head of US aid. Does anyone know what US aid is and why it's been in the news recently? Advait, go ahead.
USAID is a US government agency which basically provides international foreign aid to bodies like the WHO and other NGOs around the world. But recently, Trump issued an executive order to actually stop USAID, even though it's a government body, and they literally sealed their office. So that's why it's been in the news lately.
Exactly. So that's exactly right. It's the government agency through which the US disperses humanitarian aid to developing countries. They do a huge number of things. They fund healthcare, they fund political movements, they fund kind of workforce training and schools. So they do a whole bunch of things. And Donald Trump and his friends, with their America First agenda, really don't like the idea of the US spending money on what they see as unnecessary things for other countries. So they've shut it down. So Samantha Power, under the Biden administration, was the head of USAID. And so she's someone who really knows what she's talking about. And she's written this really beautiful 3 paragraphs kind of describing things. But I think in these paragraphs is hidden a ton of assumptions about what she thinks characterizes all developing and underdeveloped countries. So what I want to do is go through and see what are those characteristics that people normally associate with lack of development. So who wants to go? Just put your hand up and I'll go down the list and ask people. Niyati?
Lack of proper facilities for the people.
Can you tie it to what she says here? I think that's correct. What is she saying here that makes you think that lack of proper facilities is a feature of a country that's not developed? Nita, you can answer that if you want. So what here in these 3 paragraphs indicates that there is a lack of facilities?
So in the second paragraph, it is mentioned that there is countries average fewer than 3 doctors per 10,000 people, which is basically referring to how there's a shortage of doctors for the people, even though the virus is spread quite a bit.
Cool. So shortage of doctors is one. Himanshu?
Yeah, and in the first paragraph, Samantha Power wants to convey to us that that because clinics in this community have fewer no gloves, masks, coronavirus tests, ventilators. So she also mentions that the entire country of South Sudan has 4 ventilators. So this is alarming, and this talks about the state of the underdevelopment of the countries.
Himanshu, so that's useful in what she's saying, but what is the feature or characteristic that you draw from that? So like the person who just spoke before said, the fact that she mentions that there are only 3 doctors per 10,000 means that healthcare facilities are poor. So what are you taking away from it about developing countries?
I think they don't have they don't have, as she mentioned before, they don't have proper healthcare facilities. Additional to that, they don't have advanced machinery to identify the virus and battle. So they're lagging behind on machinery.
Yeah, so machinery is not quite the right word here. I think you mean technology. So she talks about how they don't have ventilators and no ability to kind of monitor this. So that lack of technology is a good one. Okay, who's going next? Himanshu? No, Himanshu just went. Abira?
Yeah. So basically, it talks about the low skilled labor present in developing countries, which leads to lower per capita income and lower livings of standards for each and everyone. There's also high liability on the rich people because there exist more poor people in the status quo.
Okay, so I think there's a few different ideas there. One is, and this is obvious but important to note, is that the idea is that countries that aren't developed are poor. So that's the first one. There's just less money. The GDP is lower. The per capita GDP is lower. There's a large number of poor people there. You also mentioned that there's low skilled labor. There's a term that she uses in her 3rd paragraph, which reflects or kind of connects to skilled labor. What term is that? Does anyone know? You can unmute and say.
Make a living.
Informal economy. Informal economy, exactly.
Economy.
That's right. So the fact that there's a large informal economy. What is an informal economy?
Where the people are most of the workers are in the informal sector or unorganized sector.
And what is the informal sector?
For the informal sector, where the company is not, they don't get regular wages, they don't get regular salary, and they don't have any social security policies for them.
Yeah, I think you're in the right direction, but the informal economy just means unregistered firms. So
Unregistered
if
firms, yes.
I register a company with the government, then that becomes a part of the formal economy. That means that my company pays taxes. It means I'm bound by certain laws about how I need to treat my employees. But if I'm working in, and if I run an informal organization, that means I haven't registered it. I may or may not follow these laws. So I may be paying my employees wages, but maybe I'm not paying them the minimum wage because no one is checking. I may not be giving them healthcare and insurance and all of the other things that I need to give as a company. I also, it means probably I'm not paying taxes to the government to the amount that I should. Cool, good observation. Tanuj, what did you have? And let's make sure not to repeat anything. That's all.
Yes, so I think all the reasons tie back to the problems just being that these are poor countries. Also, just like most problems are linking back to the lack of information that most of these people have. So they're unable to follow all of these sanitation protocols just because they don't have the kind of information to actually know that these are very crucial.
Okay, so lack of information, that's interesting. So people might be unaware in some ways. They might be, and the governmental institutions that are meant to spread information might not be working very effectively. Rhythm? No, Anika?
She implies that there's a lack of infrastructure, especially in terms of standard of living, in terms of housing. In the second paragraph, she says where distancing saving lives is essentially out of the question, implying that all of the houses that they live in are really closely located, implying that they're in slums or those sort of areas. So poor standard of living, poor housing infrastructure.
Poor housing infrastructure is a great one. Lots of people live in slums or in refugee camps. Prakriti?
The situation in their country is not that great for them to concentrate on the COVID-19, and because it's said in the poor, displaced, and conflict affected communities around the world.
Yeah, good point. So there's this almost conflation. Do you guys know what the term conflation means? So conflation means when you take two concepts that may or may not be related and you present them as related. So she conflates the idea of being a poor country and in the same breath is saying displaced and conflict ridden, which creates this image of if you are a developing country, then that means that there must be greater levels of violence and conflict within your countries. And there must be a great amount of displacement, which means people being forced out of their own homes and regions into other areas or other countries as refugees. So really good thing there. So we've talked about the fact that these countries are poor. We've talked about the fact that there's conflict, there's low levels of technology, labor is less skilled. There's a large informal economy, there's poor housing infrastructure and people living in slums, there's a lack of information. And then the one thing that you guys haven't talked about here, which is also interesting, is she keeps mentioning over and over again 3 billion people, millions spend their life, densely packed areas, hundreds of millions in developing countries. What's she getting at there? What's the kind of like image of developing countries that she's painting there? Yeah, Tanuj, maybe?
I think the image she's trying to paint is that all of these countries are likely to have a lot of huge population and the people getting out displaced are like really, really huge.
Exactly. So there's also this conflation of the idea that if you are a developing country, then you must also have a high population. I'm saying all of this because two reasons. One is these may or may not be true. To some extent, it is true that on all of these indicators, developing countries do worse than developed countries. Obviously, definitionally, they are poorer. It is statistically true that they're more likely to experience violence, more likely to have poor infrastructure, and so on. But it isn't necessarily true. And I think that there's some value in challenging these assumptions because otherwise people have this tendency to put all developing countries under the same bracket and say they all suffer from these problems. But the second is because you then, as a debater, need to be, when you're thinking about a debate about a developing country, should be thinking about all of these different facets and seeing how can the policy that you're talking about may affect these other aspects of that country as well. So if you're doing a debate about rural-urban migration, so the movement of people from villages into cities in developing countries. The obvious arguments are about people's ability to get better paying jobs and contribute to the economy. But you might also want to think, so maybe if they move from villages to cities, what does that do to kind of the density of population and housing infrastructure? What does it do to healthcare? What does it do to education? So by thinking on all of these different facets, you're able to build a more comprehensive case about it. So this is just kind of outlining the various things that we talked about. Good job in identifying all of these. When we say developing world, we mean largely countries in the continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. There are some exceptions, especially in Asia. You have countries like Singapore, South Korea that are considered developed. You have countries like China, which are on par with developed countries now, even though some people still talk about it as developing. I'm not keeping a close eye on the chat, so if anyone's putting things in the chat, I'm not looking at it right now. One common thing that unites a lot of these countries is that they were historically colonized, because in the past, developed countries, i.e. the US, the UK, other countries in Europe like Spain and Portugal, had colonized a lot of the developing world. And that's another common characteristic of developing countries that isn't flagged in the paragraph that we read from Samantha Power, but is common to them as well. To what extent are these associations true? And you realize that to a large extent, it is. So if you look at, this is a map of the kind of development where a country's land on the developed, developing, least developed. And if you look at how they do on the Human Development Index, so the Human Development Index is an index of the UN that takes into account education levels, per capita income, and also life expectancy in countries to kind of create a ranking. And you see that there's a significant amount of overlap. There are obviously some differences in South America, for example, where there are countries that might be developing, but among the highest in human development. But to a large extent, these do overlap a lot. So returning to the question then, the question of development and economic growth are two interrelated but slightly separate things. Economic growth refers to the GDP of the country increasing. And at best, you can think of per capita GDP, which means when you divide up the GDP by everyone in the population, how much is the average person making compared to how they were doing earlier. But development is a much wider thing that takes into account people's health and standard of living, their education levels, the rights that people have, especially women and minorities, and development is a much more comprehensive thing. So let's look at those two things separately. How does economic growth occur? This could not be an economics lecture without an equation, so get ready for the first and only equation of this presentation. This equation is trying to understand what Y is broken into. And what does Y mean? Does anyone know?
Income.
Like, repeat.
Income.
Income. So Y stands for income, i.e. the money that people in a country are making. So that's the GDP. That's the GDP. And there was this economist called Solow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who came up with this growth model called the Solow growth model. And he broke down the income of a country into four different things, which are K, L, H, and A. Don't ask me why those are the acronyms, but here's what each of them stands for. And he said, and this is largely backed up by the evidence, that a country grows its income by growing one or more of the following things. First is capital. The second is labor. The third is human capital. And the fourth is efficiency or productivity. Capital refers to the physical things that we need in order to create an income. This means land, it means factories, it means buildings, it means machinery, all of that. You need that in order to develop, because if you don't have that, you are not actually creating the kind of setups that you need in order to create new products that you can then sell in the market to create an income. The second is labor. Labor refers to the number of people that are in the workforce. So almost always we've seen that as more people enter the workforce, the total income of the country increases. So when Historically, women were left out of the workforce, even in developed countries. When women entered the workforce, and in developed countries, a lot of them entered the workforce after the First and Second World Wars, because so many of the men fought in the wars, and therefore somebody had to kind of keep the income, keep the economy going, keep livelihoods going, and women stepped into the workforce in large numbers. That caused a boost in the overall income of the country. So we have this idea that overpopulation is a bad thing, increased populations is a bad thing, but actually historically what we see is that when more people enter the workforce and enter the economy, the overall GDP and income of the country increases. The third part is what's called human capital, and that's really a combination of education and healthcare. If a population is incredibly sick, they are less likely to be able to perform well and effectively. Population is uneducated, then they are less able to think of new and innovative ways to build on what we've been doing in the past, to come up with more efficient ways of creating new things and making money. Those are pretty straightforward. The thing that economists have really struggled to define over time is that if you look at countries over time and try and break it down and say, okay, we have countries over a large period of time, we know what their GDP is, we know how much physical capital they had, we know what their populations were, we know their average kind of education rates and life expectancies, that still doesn't fully explain income growth. And that's why they have this concept called A, which is either can be termed productivity or technology efficiency. So the idea there is some things that cause you to do a step up in your productivity. So when we were kind of, running agriculture using just bullock carts and physical kind of plows, you were able to reach a certain level of productivity, but you were limited by how much you could use those tools and how much those tools could produce. But when you went a step up and introduced tractors and you introduced kind of electronic machinery that could till the land and kind of sow seeds and reap and all of that, that significantly increased production, which then increased income. When you went a step above that and introduced fertilizers that were chemically produced and more efficient, it further increased the amount that a given plot of land and a given set of people could produce. When you introduce computers, when you introduce AI, all of those are the types of step changes that cause productivity to increase. And that is the final component of what causes the overall income of a country to increase. I'm going to pause there. Any questions on any of that? I know that these are all terms that you're probably familiar with, but the reason we're going through it is because by breaking it down and being very clear about what the different categories are, once again, when you're faced with a debate about economic growth, you can think about, now I have to come up with arguments. How does this motion affect physical capital? How does it affect labor? How does it affect human capital? How does it affect technological efficiency? Abira, go ahead.
Yeah. Sir, so when you said capital, does it also refer to maybe capitalism, industrialism, industries, the growth of industrialists?
Yeah, so the term capitalism actually is very closely tied to the idea of capital, where capitalism is a form of government, where a form of economic structuring where capital is super important, and capital is valued sometimes even over labor or other things. We'll get into that in a second. Himanshu?
I have a very fundamental question out here. If people in a semi-developed nation, let's say like China, immigrate to developed nations, who will develop the country forward? So, in case we are asked, in case in a debate we are asked by our opponent whether is it, I mean, in a debate with the topic, the House the House strongly supports that people in developing countries should go to developed countries and leave the land, but how will the developing countries become developed if the cream of the crop goes to the developed countries and enjoys their life over there?
Got it.
How does it?
Good question, not directly related to this, but I can quickly answer that. The way that you would argue that is, first, these countries, as we have talked about in the previous slide, have enormous populations. Even if 10% of the population leaves, there is still loads of really good people in those countries, it is not possible for everyone to leave. And in fact, there's probably more people that want to get an education, that want to improve their skills, than there are good universities and spots at those universities. So really, when some set of people leave, it's just creating the opportunities for more people. The second is that when people leave, they often send back what's called remittances, and these can be really powerful in growing an economy. So a person will make way more money in the developed world than they will make in the developing world, but they still have family back home. They still have social connections back home. They still have schools and hospitals that they went to back home that they care about, and they're likely to send money back. And that money can infuse capital into this economy that allows it to grow in a way that it wasn't growing before. The final thing is to challenge the idea that movement is a kind of single time thing that never changes. And what I mean by that is most of the people that go may never come back, but some set of people that go do come back, and they come back with new ideas, new exposure, new ways of thinking. There's a reason that a number of the biggest startups in India, for example, are set up by people who had gone to the US, who were working there, and then, for example, didn't get the H-1B lottery. I'm pretty sure a couple of the founders of Flipkart were people who had been working in the US, but then couldn't continue working there because their visas were denied. They came back to India with all of these new ideas, and they might come back because they want to. Their parents are growing older, and they want to spend more time with them. Even if they don't physically come back, the companies that they're running or working in the developed world might collaborate with companies in their home countries, bringing in new technology and abilities for them to improve. So those are some of the different ways that you would argue that emigration into the developed world can actually be good for developing countries. Cool. Ritim, I'll take your question really quickly, and then we will keep moving.
Yeah, my question was that what's the difference between human capital and labor? Wouldn't labor come under human capital?
Labor just means the number of people. It just refers to the number of bodies. Human capital is the quality of that labor. How healthy are they? How intelligent are they? And so on.
Okay.
Because let's say that you have a piece of land, that's your physical capital, and you want to grow as many crops as you want in that piece, as you can in that piece of land. One way is if you go from having one person working on that piece of land doing everything. He's the one who has to wake up in the morning, go to the market, buy the seeds, come back, plant the seeds, sow it, reap it, all of that. And you bring in someone to help him. Even if those two people are the dumbest people on the planet, just the fact that there are two people will mean that that farm is likely to do better than when there was just one person. Now, of course, there's some limit at which that stops happening. If you have 70 people on a piece of land, that probably isn't going to be super helpful, but up till some extent, increasing the number of people working with the same amount of capital will be effective. But you can also think of another way where you replace the person who's working on that land with someone who's just much smarter, much quicker at working. So let's say you take like an 80-year-old man 80-year-old farmer who's trying to till a piece of land himself, and replace him with an able-bodied, energetic 30-year-old man. All of a sudden, the amount of crops that piece of land creates will increase, not because you've increased the labor, but because you've increased the human capital on that piece of land. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, but how does this is different from efficiency? I'm replacing an 80-year-old man to a 30-year. Like, am I not increasing the efficiency of that?
So human capital refers to the internal characteristics of a person that makes them better at doing a piece of work. Efficiency usually refers to an economy-wide or technological change that occurs that makes everyone more efficient. So the introduction of the tractor made everyone, no matter how smart or dumb you were, more efficient than they were before.
Okay, makes sense.
Awesome. So historically, at least in like the late 1990s and early 2000s, free trade was considered the best driver of economic growth. There was a sense that countries grew by opening up their economies, by allowing competition. Competition meant that people had more choices. They would go and buy from the most effective companies. The less effective companies would die out. If the most effective companies came in from abroad, that was still fine. It forced the worst ones to compete. Free trade also means that countries can do what's called specialization, where they focus on what they are good at, and they choose not to do the things that they're not that good at and buy those from other countries or other areas and make their money by selling what they've made to those other countries or areas. The US, the UK, the people that created the World Trade Organization were some of the big promoters of this. And you had instances where organizations like the World Bank or IMF required, as a condition of helping a developing country, that those countries had to open up their economies, allow any company to come in, reduce protections that they gave to their domestic economies. But what's interesting is that many of the countries that advocated it most vocally, when they were in their period of economic development, didn't do it through a free trade structure. So a number of the countries like the United Kingdom or Spain or Germany grew through either colonialism or through kind of on the backs of populations that didn't have the freedom of movement and choice. So in the US, slavery was a huge system that contributed to the economic growth of the country back in the day. And you're seeing that even today, more and more countries are going back towards protectionism. So you have all of these conversations about Trump applying tariffs to other countries. Tariffs are the opposite of free trade because it's saying, I will not treat goods coming in from another country equal to the goods produced in my country. And so I think free trade was super in vogue for a period of about 50, 70 years. But it was not the way that countries have historically developed, and is also something that more and more people are now realizing, hey, maybe this isn't quite in the best interests of our own countries. So that covers kind of the idea of economic growth. How do you get GDP to increase? As we've talked about, GDP is just one part of the puzzle. You can make a country very wealthy while not necessarily helping the people in that country live their best possible lives. So what are some ways of structuring society overall to try and create more equal outcomes? One is to try and enforce equal outcomes. So many countries historically have tried building communist societies. Communist societies are ones where are basically the opposite of a capitalist free trade system, where there's a central institution, usually the state, and a planning committee that decides what is being produced, who gets to produce it, and how much they're producing. The returns from that production are then distributed as equally as possible to all of the people in the country. Who knows what some of the issues that countries that tried to grow through communism faced? Tanuj?
Particularly in like communist Russia, they ended up like not actually practicing communism. Instead, like they tried to like practice communism the way they wanted to. So like Stalin ended up using communism in a way which like ended up like
it's a good point, but could you we're looking for structural reasons why that might be the case. So you have one thing in there, which is you mentioned Stalin. So communism does depend on the central authority working effectively and knowing what's best for the country. It creates a huge amount of centralization of power where if that is truly incredibly efficient and benevolent, then it could work well. But if that person is dumb, if that person is mean, if that person has misplaced priorities or ideas, then it could go horribly wrong. So you had situations where communist leaders in China and Russia tried to move enormous numbers of people from cities into villages to try and create more equal rural areas. And it resulted effectively in mass starvation. So it depends on the central committee getting the things right, which they may not for a whole number of reasons. What are other reasons why it didn't work?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so basically, like when we talk about communism, it means like, for example, if I have 1 kilogram of rice, so everybody gets a kilogram of rice. And if I have more, then the government will redistribute it to the poor so that everybody has lump sum equal amounts of rice so that there's equality. But the main problem is that in this scenario, nobody is motivated to work harder. Nobody will be motivated, because once I earn money, once I earn maybe 2 kilograms of rice, I already know that the government will be redistributing that rice to the poor, so that I won't be having that much, like, for example, rice.
That's right.
And
So that is also a problem that communism struggled with, which is that both the average person is not motivated to try and work harder and do more, create more, and people have less of an incentive to be entrepreneurial and innovative and come up with new and better technology, new and better methods of production that lead to everyone being better off, because they realize that even if they put in a ton of work and effort and do that, they will still not themselves be better off. And while a lot of people are nice people, they care about others, people also do care about themselves and their families. And so it reduces the incentive to be innovative. Himanshu?
One more problem, many of the, as she mentioned earlier, she mentioned that many of the people are not motivated, and this also leads in protests. So the Tiananmen Square massacre is, an example to elucidate my statement. And due to this, there's a lot of unrest in the country.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense, Himanshu. So I think there is some amount of political repression that comes under communism almost definitionally, because if communism requires a centralized committee that tells people what to do, people might not want to be told what to do. They might want to make their own decisions. They might want to do create the kinds of things that they want to create. And so inevitably, it's hard to be both kind of democratic and free and communist. And people rebel against that, and it can end up hurting a lot of people. Let's have one final one from Shaurya, and then we'll move on.
So, sir, in the Communist Manifesto, it is not anywhere talked about that what kind of government a communist country we have. So, what happens is that in a communist evolution, the most violent people and the most rebellious people often get to form the government, and which doesn't lead to a good thing.
Yeah. So, how do you decide who the leaders are? There is no clear way. Whereas, you could have a capitalist structure, and most capitalist structures are also democratic. And in a democracy, you have a much clearer way of voting for people that you think are good. And if they do badly, you have a method to kick them out and replace them with better people as well. We also tried resource-based development. That was another one that didn't really work very well. These are two countries that are quite different to each other. The first one, I think, is from the UAE. I'll have to go back and check. The second is Botswana. And it worked to some extent in the Middle East. What was the resource that the Middle East used to grow?
Oil.
Oil, yeah. So they have enormous amounts of oil, and they grew really effectively using oil. But that came with a whole bunch of issues of its own. From an economic perspective, one of the biggest issues with resource-based development is that it locks you into that resource. When one resource is providing so much money, you have less of an incentive as a government or as an individual to try and diversify into new industries, new areas. And so if something happens, for example, if the oil in your country starts running out, or if the demand for oil decreases because people are moving towards using electric vehicles or green energy, or if some other country is able to produce that resource at a cheaper way. So, for example, the US was able to both find oil in its own country as well as use shale gas as an alternative to oil. All of a sudden, you are struggling because you have not developed other industries, and your only industry that you've got is falling out of favor. And the other thing with resource-based countries is because if you are a resource-based country, and this is an interesting argument, and this is what played out in the Middle East in particular, the people that are ruling that country have access to enormous amounts of money because of the oil that's being created, because oil and these natural resources tend to be governmentally owned, and you can't have a bunch of small companies that are setting up oil firms. It tends to be a few very large companies that are usually politically motivated. That means that they don't have to depend on taxing individual people to get money to run their governments and their countries. And you might think that's a good thing. It's great that people aren't being taxed. But the flip side of it is that when people aren't paying taxes and governments aren't dependent on people's taxes, they're also less responsive to people's needs and have the ability to use that money to stifle protest, to shut things down if they feel like it's not going their way. So resource-led development can, even if it works in making countries richer, can be really risky, and can cause people to not get access to other things that they care about, like freedom and equal rights and all of that. But it doesn't even economically work in many instances. So some of the most resource-rich countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Botswana, where in trying to get access to these resources, and because that is the only way to grow as a person or as a company, there's an incentive to try and be violent in getting access to these resources. If you do get access to these resources, you have an incentive to try and shut other people out, and it can cause an enormous amount of conflict that tears a country apart. The one model that we did see success in historically has been what's called state-led development. Who can tell me the names of these 4 countries? Advait?
Yeah, so South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and
Yeah.
Singapore.
And Singapore. Awesome. Good job. And does anyone know what the name for these 4 countries put together is, the term that's used? So they're called, in the context of economic development, the East Asian Tigers. And they're called the Tigers because they saw incredibly quick development over the course of a couple of decades, where they went from basically agrarian, very poor economies to the equivalent of developed countries, where they were super rich and people had great standards of living. What's common to a lot of to these countries and how they developed is a few things. The first is the state played a very big role, but the state was also, mostly because of luck, led by very capable people who kind of had the foresight to put the interests of the country first, who had an eye for ways that countries could develop effectively and prioritize that, who tried to diversify beyond what they just had. So Singapore could have continued just being a farmland, or done something with its fisheries and ocean, but Lee Kuan Yew was like, we need to figure out a way of developing that goes beyond that, and to turn Singapore into a financial hub for the entire world. And Hong Kong had a similar kind of process as well. In South Korea, one of the things that they did that was very effective was they said, we are going to prioritize education and prioritize women's education in particular, which had enormous long-term benefits to these countries. So one is that they were led by leaders that played a large role in shaping public policy and had right priorities. Second is that they were protectionist in effective ways. So they did not say, we are going to just open up our economies completely and let anyone come in and do whatever they want. They said, we will prioritize our local industries, but force them to become competitive globally. And the way that they did that was through what's called export-led development. So these countries started setting up industries, and China is another really good example of this, which were mainly manufacturing, but manufacturing not to sell to their own economies, but to sell mainly to the West. Why is it important to sell to the West in this context? Does someone who hasn't spoken before want to go? And if not, I'll come to you, Himanshu. Okay, Abira, you can go.
So can you just reframe your question? Like, just ask it again?
When South Korea was trying to develop its industries, why was it focused on building up industries that can sell to Western countries rather than maybe setting up industries that will serve their own populations?
Okay, so there's this phenomena where, for example, even YouTubers face this, where if they get, for example, 1,000 views in US, they earn maybe $1,000. But if they get 1,000 views in a developing nation like India, they only get $10. So
that's a good point. That's actually interesting. That's one part of it, which is if you sell to developed countries, you can sell at a higher rate because people there are rich. You can sell at for a higher price because people are richer.
Yes.
And you're earning it in a currency that is stronger. So when that money comes back into your country, it can go much longer way. But the answer is actually even simpler than that, which is these countries are poor. People in these countries are poor, and they're trying to escape that poverty. the people in those countries cannot afford and don't have the ability to buy a huge amount of things. A lot of these countries in this specific example that we're talking about of the East Asian tigers are also small countries with small populations. And so the only way that their industries could earn enormous amounts of money that would contribute to economic development was by selling to Western countries. And so states played an important role of deciding what these industries were, supporting them through state finances and protecting them from competition by not allowing other companies to enter that did similar things, and plugging into the global economy and selling globally. That then allowed them to earn the money, and then through taxes, the government also earned money that could reinvest into diversifying, into education, and all of those things. And that enabled them to succeed really effectively. Himanshu, yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I wanted to actually elucidate this point, if it's okay, with an example. So in the automotive
Himanshu,
industry,
we're running a little out of time. I know we're almost at the 8:30 mark, and I don't want us to spend too much time. So let's come back to additional explanations at the end. But thank you for offering that. Just hold that in your pocket. Maybe you can actually just put it in the chat so that everyone can look at it. The third thing that was common to all of these countries, which they got very lucky with, is that in the period that they were developing in, there was a global hegemon. Hegemon means a country that has almost universal power, is the wealthiest, is the most powerful. That was the US. And the US took an interest in, and the Western world in general, took an interest in supporting these countries and helping them develop. And so being supported by the West and being given favorable access to their markets, being given technological support, given expertise, all of that also helped these countries develop. And so what is this is a great example, because these are really a set of countries, these in China, are the only real examples of countries that have successfully gone from a poor country or a developing country to a developed country in the last sort of 50 to 75 years. And they all pursued a pretty similar path. And so it's a very interesting thing to consider when you're making arguments about free trade versus protectionism and so on, about what's important. There are other countries that are trying to adopt this playbook. To some extent, India is, though India's manufacturing base is, until very recently, much smaller than those countries were. So, and India's population is so large that there's a big enough domestic market, so they don't have to do this either. But Vietnam is a really good example of a country that's trying to follow this path as well. To some extent, Myanmar/Burma, Bangladesh are all trying to do export-led development, where the state is prioritizing certain industries, supporting them to try and help them develop. Rwanda is another good example of a country that's made progress through these. And all of these examples that I just said were countries that haven't gone from developing to developed, but are doing, on a per capita income and GDP basis, much better than they were doing 50 years ago. So we've now talked about a few different forms of development. We've talked about free trade capitalism. Well, we talked about free trade capitalism. We talked about its opposite, which is high levels of protectionism and communism. We've talked about resource-led development. We've talked about development based on enslavement or colonialism. And we've talked about state-led development. It's super useful to think about these different things, and in any debate, start thinking about what aspects of these different things can you pull in. And we also talked about how all of these different things contributes to economic growth, but economic growth is not the same thing as development, because development includes a much wider set of things that people care about, like healthcare, education, rights and equality, and so on. In any debate, think about all of these different aspects. And now, as we kind of begin wrapping up for the last 10 or so minutes, we're going to do a little activity. So we're going to say, you are the advisor to the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. You are explaining to the cabinet that Andhra Pradesh should aggressively promote foreign companies setting up in the state rather than helping local companies. What are two reasons that you would give to say that we should aggressively promote foreign companies? We should not try and help local companies. On the flip side, on the opposition party, you're trying to raise concerns around the policy. What are two reasons that you would give? So what I'm going to do is try and create breakout rooms and You guys will have 5 minutes to discuss this with the people in your room. If you are in a odd numbered room, then you are the advisor to the government. If you are in an even numbered room, you are in the opposition. So your 5 minutes starts now. Be gone, all of you.
So what do we have to do when we come back from the breakout room after discussion?
We're going to share out some of the arguments in favor and against.
Okay. And so for the odd ones, they are the advisors, and the not even ones are not the advisors, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so
Welcome back. All right. Welcome back, everyone. I think that is almost everyone. Our breakout room's closed. Excellent. Okay, let's hear it from the advisors to the government. Why do you promote letting companies come in and allowing them free reign? How is that going to help Andhra Pradesh economically? Shaurya, you go first.
So, firstly, it raises the standards in a country. For example, we had auto industry in our country before foreign investment happened, but the standard of production was very low. But now today, when after opening the economy for the auto industry, we can see that even Indian brands are competing with the international brands also in India. So it raises us.
Okay. First reason is it forces local industries to become more competitive. Prakriti.
So as an advisor to the chief minister, I would say you give access to global market and capital. So imagine a foreign company, say Tesla, sets up a manufacturing plant in Andhra Pradesh. It won't bring not only it'll bring advanced technology, but it can also attract global capital and market in renewable energy.
Great. So it brings in new technology, and I think the other part of it is foreign companies setting up in your economy will also create more jobs and employment. So
yes, I can create ripple effects, encouraging local businesses to adopt greener technologies, and that will help the environment as well. So the global influence, cultural influence would help locally in India as well.
Yeah. So your local companies will learn from these companies, will get access to their technologies, and they could even collaborate with them.
And the market, yes.
Yeah. Good point. Niyati?
I have another point to elucidate her statement.
I'm just calling Niyati. So after that, you go, Himanshu.
Yeah, by bringing in other foreign countries, we could also raise the standard and the governance, because foreign countries usually have a better work ethic. I wouldn't the work ethic, more corporate rules and governance, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good idea. You'll have to explain how that creates changes locally as well. So it is possible that they have better corporate governance. They might also just have new ways of doing things that can help that percolate into the local economy. I think it's an interesting idea. You'd have to work a little bit more on thinking about the link to how some of the things that you're talking about, like better corporate governance, will result in other companies adopting those as well. Not entirely sure what that could be, but yeah, Himanshu, go ahead.
So actually foreign collaborations with the local brands can actually help in increasing the standards of work, as she mentioned. And an example to elucidate would be Mahindra's joint venture with Ford while developing the Mahindra Scorpio. So this was a turning point in Mahindra's history, as they were usually used to making bare bone cars, but currently now that BE6 is even better than many of the cars Ford produces. The technology, it's better than a Ford Puma or even a Ford Mustang Mach-E, based on the technology. And it just helps in developing.
All right, I'm gonna stop you there. I think that's a really good example. Another classic example there is Maruti Suzuki. So Suzuki is a Japanese brand that came and collaborated with Maruti, really up the standard of cars. Great. All of these are really good arguments. I think the one thing that we didn't discuss during the session that you guys should be thinking about as well is the other benefit of free trade is not necessarily immediately economic, but customers have access to better products. So local companies might take a while to get to the stage that the Western companies are in. By allowing Western companies to come in, or foreign companies to come in that have more experience, people have access to a wider variety of products, of services that will immediately increase their standard of living. But it is also possible that it contributes economically because, say, for example, the foreign companies that you're coming in are bringing in incredibly cheap laptops. People will now have access to laptops that they didn't have before and wouldn't have had otherwise, that can enable them to be more productive, that will enable them to learn more, and so on. Excellent. All good arguments on proposition. Now let's switch to the parties in opposition. Why is this a terrible idea, and why should we be protecting our local industries? Anika, go ahead.
So I thought about this in terms of equity. Andhra Pradesh is known as a state where there are a lot of regions that are really underdeveloped and a lot of regions that are developed. So essentially, what that would mean if an MNC were to come into this state, or a lot of MNCs were to come into the state, is that they would focus on areas where there is already an economic hub that's created. This in turn would mean that all of these areas that were not as that have never been given attention to, sorry, are further neglected, right? So this would further increase the inequity amongst these areas. Whereas if you were to focus on local businesses and promoting this local businesses as a whole, it would mean people who live in these local areas, in these underdeveloped areas, are more motivated to start their own businesses and stay in those areas. This would not only mean more stable jobs for the people in Andhra Pradesh, but it would eventually lead to Andhra Pradesh as a state becoming an equal playing ground for everybody, instead of just having very specific areas of focused economic activity and neglectment of the other areas.
Got it. I think, Anika, there were three separate ideas in there, all of which I think are good, but is worth separating out. The first one is companies that are coming in from outside will naturally gravitate towards the places that have the best infrastructure, best resources. As a state, if you are choosing to prioritize specific areas, you could choose to focus on places that need more jobs, that need more support, and support those. The second is, if you know that you are going to get outcompeted by these foreign companies that are coming in, then you have less of a motivation. So the word motivation was really interesting, to start something of your own, to pursue it, to try and make it bigger. Third was this idea of stability. I think that one you didn't expand on, but there is a company that is based in Andhra Pradesh, where their families are in Andhra Pradesh. They're historically from there. They're likely to commit to the state and continue working out of there. Whereas foreign companies can be fickle. The reason they're coming in is because labor is cheap in this country, or there's a population that can buy their services. Labor is cheap in another country, they will choose to pack up and go to that country instead. And so the likelihood of good quality jobs that persist over time is less. So all three of those were interesting ideas. Roshni?
Okay, so my idea is very geopolitical. So, if foreign companies come, they can withdraw their investments, which can lead to certain job loss and economic stability, because they primarily operate on profitability and market conditions. And if the circumstances are unfavorable, they can suddenly withdraw their investments, which can leave a state of vulnerability in our economy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that is especially true in kind of sectors that are core to a region's functioning and security. So defense is a good example. A country usually tries to build local defense companies because they don't want foreign companies that are firstly and immediately accountable to their own governments to be the ones that these countries are dependent on for arms and tanks and spyware and all of the things that a country needs. That's true for energy. It's true for agriculture. So there's many areas where instability is particularly dangerous, or dependence is particularly dangerous. And so you might prioritize protection in those areas. Excellent. Ayansh, and then we will wrap up there.
Yeah, so one of my ideas is how we keep our economy independent, and that is how we do it by focusing on local industries which continue to grow the Indian economy, rather than depending on foreign investors and
But
companies
why is dependence a bad thing?
diverge from the investment due to unforeseen circumstances like a global pandemic or a world war. But also political motive, we also are not growing the economies of our foreign adversaries, maybe because China invests a lot in developing countries, and they are adversary in a case like a world war, so we are not going to help them.
Okay, I think it began being very similar to the points that were already made, but you managed to take it
Can
to
I
a new
put my point forward as well?
How about you put in the chat, Abira, because we are definitively over time and I do need to wrap up. But what I will do is, first of all, say thank you all for a great session. I appreciated all of the engagement. I'm going to put my email ID in the chat. Just as a heads up, I don't coach debate anymore. So if you're reaching out for debate coaching, then the answer is going to be no. But if you have any questions that I can be of help with, shoot me an email. And if you enjoyed the nerding out and you want to have more structured context in which you can nerd out with people who are experts in the area, I run a research program called the Lumiere Research Scholar Program, which does research programs in pretty much any field imaginable, from economics and politics, like we've been discussing, to engineering and machine learning and biology and so on. So from this conversation, it seemed like a number of you could be really good candidates for that program. So take a look. And if you're interested, feel free to drop me a line. Thank you all so much. Good luck with your debating journeys. I am excited to see where it goes. There's clearly a ton of potential in this room, and have a great weekend.